The golden light of a late summer afternoon bathed the small frontier town of Willow Creek in amber hues as Eleanor Evans clutched her worn leather purse to her chest, her knuckles white with tension. The auction had drawn nearly every resident from miles around, turning the usually quiet Main Street into a bustling marketplace. But it wasn't the fine china or farm equipment that had brought Eleanor here. It was the desperate hope of reclaiming what should never have been lost in the first place. Wyoming Territory, 1878. The West was still wild, still untamed, and still unforgiving to those who couldn't hold their ground. Eleanor, 22 years old and orphaned for nearly a year, had learned this lesson more harshly than most. Next up for auction, the Evans homestead and adjacent 30 acres, announced the portly auctioneer, his voice booming across the makeshift auction platform erected outside the bank. Bidding starts at $50. Eleanor's heart sank. The modest plot of land had been her family's pride for over a decade. Her father had worked himself to death cultivating that soil, and her mother had followed him to the grave shortly after, leaving Eleanor alone with a mountain of debt she couldn't hope to repay. The bank had been merciless, foreclosing on the property despite her tearful pleas for more time. She had scraped together every penny she could find, borrowed from the few friends she had, and sold her mother's wedding ring all to amass the princely sum of $68.42. It wouldn't be enough, she knew it wouldn't, but she had to try. "Do I hear 60? The auctioneer called after several bids quickly pushed the price up. Eleanor raised her hand timidly, her voice barely audible as she offered her $68. "The young lady offers $68, the auctioneer acknowledged, but his expression made it clear he found her presence more a nuisance than a serious participation. "75, called a gruff voice from the crowd. It belonged to Harold Jenkins, the wealthy cattle baron who had been buying up every available property in the county. Eleanor had heard whispers that he'd had his eye on her family's land for its valuable water access. 80, called another voice. 90, countered Jenkins. Eleanor's vision blurred with tears as the bidding quickly surpassed her meager savings. She bit her lips so hard she tasted blood, trying desperately to maintain her composure as her last hope slipped away. $100, announced Jenkins with smug confidence. The auctioneer looked around. $100 going once, going twice. $150, Eleanor cried out desperately, knowing full well she didn't have the money. A hushed murmur swept through the crowd. Everyone knew Eleanor Evans didn't have that kind of money. The auctioneer frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Miss Evans, this is not a charity event. If you cannot produce the funds, she can't pay that," someone called out from the crowd. "Little orphan girls just wasting everyone's time. Probably still thinks Daddy's gonna come back and save the day." Another voice jeered. Eleanor's cheeks burned with humiliation as the first hot tear slid down her face. She tried to blink the rest away, but they kept coming, streaming silently down her face as the crowd's laughter grew louder. "Look at her crying like a child," a woman's voice cut through the noise. As if tears ever saved anyone from debt, Eleanor wanted to disappear, to sink into the ground and never emerge again. The mocking faces around her blurred through her tears, becoming a grotesque carnival of cruelty. She turned to flee, nearly colliding with a tall figure who had stepped directly into her path. "Those tears are the last she'll shed," came a deep, steady voice that silenced the crowd. Eleanor looked up into the face of a stranger, a man in his late 20s, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a storm-darkened sky. His brown Stetson was pulled low, but not low enough to hide the intensity of his gaze as he studied her face for a moment before turning toward the auctioneer. $200 for the Evans property, he announced clearly, his voice carrying across the now hushed gathering. "Cash." He pulled a leather wallet from his vest pocket, extracting several bills and holding them up for all to see. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "I have $200 from the gentleman. Do I hear any other bids?" Harold Jenkins scowled but remained silent. No one else spoke up. "Sold to Mr." The auctioneer looked questioningly at the stranger. "Thomas Sullivan," the man replied, stepping forward to complete the transaction. Eleanor stood frozen, watching as this stranger, this Thomas Sullivan, handed over more money than she had ever seen in one place. The property that had been her whole world was now his, and she had no idea why he had bought it or what he intended to do with it. As the crowd dispersed, Thomas turned to face her. Up close, she noticed the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of long days under the harsh prairie sun and the slight scar that ran along his jawline. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand why you not here," he interrupted quietly. "Too many prying eyes and loose tongues. Meet me at the property in an hour." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the middle of the street, tears drying on her cheeks, clutching her useless purse of money, and wondering if this strange encounter was a miracle or merely the prelude to further heartbreak. The ride back to her family's homestead, no, Thomas Sullivan's homestead now, was the longest of Eleanor's life. She drove the old wagon slowly, trying to memorize every tree, every bend in the road, knowing this might be her last journey along this familiar path. The small cabin came into view, its weathered logs and sagging porch a welcome sight despite everything. Thomas Sullivan was already there, his horse tethered to the hitching post her father had built years ago. He stood on the porch, gazing out at the land stretching before him, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Sullivan," Eleanor called softly as she approached. "I've come as you asked." He turned, nodding in acknowledgement. "Miss Evans." "I want to thank you for what you did back there," she began, though the words caught in her throat. "But I also need to understand why." Thomas studied her for a long moment, his gaze direct but not unkind. "I knew your father," he finally said. "Joseph Evans was a good man. He helped me when few others would." Eleanor's eyes widened. Her father had never mentioned a Thomas Sullivan. As if reading her thoughts, he continued, "It was years ago. I was passing through, young and foolish, got myself shot in a dispute that wasn't even mine. Your father found me bleeding in the woods on his property, brought me here to this cabin, and your mother tended my wounds while I recovered." "I don't remember this," Eleanor said, frowning. "You wouldn't. You were just a child, maybe 6 or 7. Your father kept me hidden. The men looking for me weren't the forgiving type. I stayed for nearly 3 weeks, and in that time, Joseph Evans taught me more about honor and decency than my own father ever did." Eleanor felt a fresh wave of grief wash over her. It sounded exactly like something her father would do, risking his family's safety to help a stranger in need. "When I heard about the auction in town, I made inquiries," Thomas continued. "Learning it was the Evans homestead." He shook his head. "I couldn't let it go to someone like Jenkins." Hope flared in Eleanor's heart. "Then you'll sell it back to me. I can work, save money. I'll pay you every cent with interest." Thomas held up a hand to stop her. "I have a different proposition." He gestured to the land around them. "This is good property, but it needs work. The fences need mending, the fields need planting, and that roof won't last another winter." Eleanor nodded, all too aware of how the property had declined during her parents' illnesses and after their deaths. "I've been looking to settle somewhere," Thomas said carefully. "I've spent too many years drifting, but I don't know the first thing about running a homestead. I know cattle, horses, and how to handle trouble. That's about it." "What are you suggesting, Mr. Sullivan?" Eleanor asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "A partnership of sorts. The property remains in my name legally, but it's your home. You continue to live here, teach me what I need to know about running this place, and in return, I'll provide protection and help with the heavy work. We share the profits from whatever the land produces." Eleanor blinked, stunned by the unexpected offer. "Why would you do that? You own this land now. You could simply hire someone to work it for you." Thomas looked away, a muscle in his jaw tightening. "I owe your father a debt I can never repay. This is the least I can do." He paused. "And I meant what I said in town, about the tears. No one should mock another's pain." Eleanor considered his words carefully. The arrangement was unusual, to say the least, but what choice did she have? She had nowhere else to go, no family to turn to. Where would you stay? She asked, practical concerns coming to the forefront. "The barn has a small room. It's good enough for now. Later, perhaps we can build another cabin on the property." Eleanor nodded slowly. I accept your offer, Mr. Sullivan, but I want your word that this is a true partnership. I won't be a servant on my own land. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You have my word, Miss Evans, and please call me Thomas, then you must call me Eleanor. They shook hands, and in that moment, with the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across what was once again her home, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time: hope. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Thomas threw himself into the work of restoring the homestead. He mended fences, repaired the roof, and helped Eleanor prepare the fields for winter wheat. He was a quick learner, absorbing everything Eleanor taught him about the rhythms and requirements of the land. Eleanor, for her part, found herself watching him when he wasn't looking. Thomas Sullivan was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. He worked from dawn till dusk without complaint, yet she sometimes caught him staring off into the distance, a haunted expression in his eyes. He was unfailingly polite, but maintained a careful distance, retreating to the barn room each evening after dinner. One evening, as they sat on the porch after a particularly grueling day of work, Eleanor finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her. What did you do before you came here, Thomas? You mentioned knowing cattle and horses. Thomas was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed. A bit of everything. Cowhand, scout, lawman for a while, he paused. Bounty hunter most recently. Eleanor's eyebrows rose. Is that how you had the money for the auction? Bounties, he nodded, his expression guarded. It's not work I'm proud of, but it paid well. And now, she asked softly, do you miss the excitement of that life compared to this? She gestured to the quiet homestead around them. Thomas considered her question, his storm-gray eyes reflecting the last light of day. I've seen enough excitement to last several lifetimes, Eleanor. There's something to be said for knowing where you'll lay your head at night, for working land that gives back what you put into it. He looked at her directly. For companionship that doesn't involve a bottle or a gun. Heat rose to Eleanor's cheeks at the intensity of his gaze, though she knew he meant nothing improper by it. Their arrangement was strictly practical, after all. Still, she couldn't deny the flutter in her stomach whenever he was near, or how she found herself making extra efforts with her appearance despite the practical demands of farm work. The townspeople, predictably, had begun to talk. When Thomas and Eleanor rode into town together for supplies, whispers followed them. Some wondered aloud about the propriety of their living arrangement, while others speculated that Thomas had ulterior motives for his generosity. Eleanor tried to ignore the gossip, but it stung nonetheless. Don't let them bother you, Thomas said quietly as they loaded their purchases into the wagon one afternoon, having overheard particularly vicious comments from the mayor's wife. People with empty lives fill them with empty talk. I'm used to it, Eleanor replied, though her tight smile belied her words. Ever since my parents died, I've been the object of their pity and judgment. Poor Eleanor Evans, too stubborn to accept charity, too proud to marry the first man who offered. Thomas's eyebrows shot up. Someone proposed to you, Eleanor laughed without humor. Harold Jenkins, right after my father's funeral, said a young woman like me shouldn't be alone, that he could use a pretty wife to host his business dinners. She shuddered at the memory. He didn't take my refusal well. I suspect that's why he was so determined to buy our land at the auction. A muscle twitched in Thomas's jaw. Jenkins is a snake. You're well rid of him. That doesn't change the fact that this town sees me as either an object of pity or a scandal waiting to happen, Eleanor said, securing the last of their supplies. Now they see me as both. Thomas helped her up onto the wagon seat before climbing up beside her. What matters is how we see ourselves, Eleanor, not them. Their return journey was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. As they crested the hill overlooking the homestead, Eleanor gasped. Smoke was rising from near the barn. Thomas immediately spurred the horses to a gallop. As they drew closer, they could see flames licking at the side of the barn where Thomas's room was located. 3 men on horseback were visible, watching the blaze. Jenkins's men, Thomas muttered, leaping from the still-moving wagon and drawing his revolver. Get to the house and stay there, he ordered Eleanor. Instead, she grabbed the bucket from the wagon and raced to the well. I'm not hiding while our home burns, she called back. The men by the barn spotted them and quickly mounted up. One of them shouted something Eleanor couldn't make out, and then they were galloping away, clearly not interested in confronting Thomas. For the next hour, they fought the fire together, passing buckets of water back and forth until finally the last ember was extinguished. The barn was damaged but salvageable. Thomas's small room, however, was completely destroyed, along with all his possessions. Everything I owned was in there, Thomas said quietly, surveying the charred remains. His expression was calm, but Eleanor could see the controlled fury in his eyes. I'm so sorry, Eleanor whispered, fighting back tears of rage and frustration. This is Jenkins's revenge. It's my fault, no. Thomas's voice was firm. This is not your fault. This is what men like Jenkins do when they don't get their way. They destroy what others build. He picked up a charred piece of wood and examined it thoughtfully. We'll rebuild. Better than before, but first I need to pay a visit to Mr. Jenkins. Alarm shot through Eleanor. Thomas, no, he has men, guns. This is exactly what he wants, an excuse to get rid of you legally. I'm not planning to shoot the man, Eleanor, Thomas said, his voice softer as he noted her concern. But he needs to understand that actions have consequences. Eleanor stepped closer, placing her hand on his arm. Please, we've lost enough today. I couldn't bear it if. She couldn't finish the sentence, the possibility too painful to voice. Thomas looked down at her hand on his arm, then at her face, his expression softening. All right, he agreed reluctantly, but this can't go unanswered. We'll answer it by succeeding, Eleanor said firmly. By making this place thrive despite his attempts to destroy it. Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on her face. You're a remarkable woman, Eleanor Evans. The nearness of him, the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. For a moment she thought he might move closer, might finally bridge the careful distance he had maintained between them. Instead, he stepped back, clearing his throat. We should assess the rest of the damage. Eleanor nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. You'll have to stay in the house tonight. There's a small room off the kitchen that my father used as a study. It's not much, but it will be fine, Thomas assured her. Thank you. That evening, as they ate a simple dinner at the kitchen table, the new proximity between them seemed to charge the air with unspoken tensions. Having Thomas inside the house rather than in his separate quarters in the barn changed something fundamental about their arrangement. They were no longer partners maintaining a respectable distance, but a man and woman sharing living quarters. This changes things, Eleanor said finally, voicing what they both were thinking. Thomas nodded, his expression serious. I know, the talk in town will get worse. I don't care about the talk, Eleanor said with surprising vehemence. I care about what's right, about what we're building here, she hesitated. About you. Thomas's eyes met hers, searching. Eleanor, let me finish, she said quickly, before her courage failed her. These past weeks, working beside you, learning who you are, I've come to care for you, Thomas, more than as a partner in this land. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, as if her words caused him physical pain. Eleanor, you don't know everything about me, about the things I've done. Then tell me, she challenged. Let me decide for myself what kind of man you are. Thomas pushed back from the table, running a hand through his hair in frustration. I've killed men, Eleanor, not just as a lawman doing my duty, as a bounty hunter, tracking them like animals. Were they dangerous men, criminals? Yes, but that doesn't change, it changes everything, Eleanor insisted. You brought justice where there was none. That doesn't make you a bad man. It makes you someone who was willing to do what others couldn't. Thomas shook his head. You see what you want to see. I see you, Eleanor said softly. The man who stood up for a crying woman at an auction, who works from sunrise to sunset without complaint, who treats me as an equal when most men would try to take charge of everything. She stood and moved around the table to stand before him. I see you, Thomas Sullivan, and I'm not afraid of what I see. Thomas looked up at her, conflict evident in his eyes. I promised your father I'd always protect you if I got the chance, he said quietly. I'm not sure this is what he had in mind. My father would have wanted me to be happy, Eleanor replied. Are you saying you don't feel anything for me? The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions. Finally, Thomas stood, bringing them face to face, close enough that Eleanor could feel the warmth of his breath. "I feel everything for you," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I've ever felt for anyone. That's why I've kept my distance." "You deserve better than a man with blood on his hands." Eleanor reached up, placing her palm against his cheek. "I decide what I deserve, Thomas Sullivan, and I think I deserve a chance at happiness with the man I'm falling in love with." Thomas closed his eyes, leaning into her touch for a moment, before gently taking her hand and lowering it. "I won't disrespect you under your own roof, Eleanor. If these feelings between us are real, they'll still be there when we've had time to think clearly." Eleanor wanted to argue, but something in his expression stopped her. This was a man who took his promises seriously, including whatever promise he had made to her father. "All right," she conceded, "but this conversation isn't over." Thomas's lips curved into a rare smile. "I wouldn't expect it to be. You're as stubborn as Joseph always said you were." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Eleanor was gathering eggs from the henhouse when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. She looked up to see Sheriff Miller riding toward the house, his expression grim. Thomas emerged from the barn, where he had been assessing the damage in daylight, and walked to meet the sheriff. Eleanor hurried to join them, her heart pounding with apprehension. "Sullivan," the sheriff greeted Thomas with a nod before turning to Eleanor. "Miss Evans." "What brings you out this way, Sheriff?" Thomas asked, his tone casual but his posture alert. "Got a complaint from Harold Jenkins," the sheriff said, dismounting. "Says you threatened him in town this morning." Eleanor looked at Thomas in surprise. He had left before dawn, saying he needed to check something in town, but had been back by breakfast. He hadn't mentioned any confrontation with Jenkins. "Is that what he said?" Thomas replied evenly. "Said you burst into his office, put a gun to his head, and told him if anything happened on this property again, you'd make sure he never lived to enjoy the results." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "That true, Sullivan?" "No," Thomas said simply. "I did visit Jenkins this morning. Told him I knew he was behind the fire, and that if he had a problem with me, he should address it to me directly instead of destroying property and endangering Miss Evans." "And the gun," the sheriff pressed. "Never left its holster," Thomas said. "Jenkins is lying, which isn't surprising considering he's the type of man who sends others to do his dirty work." The sheriff sighed, glancing between them. "Look, I know Jenkins is no saint, and I suspect you're telling me the truth, Sullivan. But he's got 3 witnesses who claim they saw you draw your weapon." "His men, no doubt," Eleanor interjected. "The same ones who set our barn on fire yesterday." "Can you prove that?" the sheriff asked. Eleanor's frustrated silence was answer enough. "That's the problem here," the sheriff continued. "I can't prove Jenkins's men set the fire, and I can't prove Jenkins is lying about this morning. It's your word against his." He paused. "But Jenkins has influence in this county more than I'd like. Are you here to arrest me, Sheriff?" Thomas asked quietly. The sheriff hesitated. "Not today. I'm here to warn you. Jenkins is pushing for charges: assault, threatening behavior. I've held him off for now, but if there's another incident..." He let the implication hang in the air. "There won't be," Eleanor said firmly. "Not from our side." The sheriff nodded, seemingly relieved. "Good, that's what I wanted to hear." He turned to remount his horse, then paused. "One more thing, people in town are talking about your living arrangements here. Might be wise to consider making things more conventional, if you take my meaning." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, but before she could respond, Thomas spoke. "Thank you for the advice, Sheriff. We appreciate your candor." After the sheriff rode away, Eleanor turned to Thomas, anger flashing in her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me you confronted Jenkins?" "Because I knew you'd worry," Thomas replied, "and because I didn't want you involved if things went badly. We're partners, Thomas. That means no secrets." Thomas looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "You're right. I'm sorry." His simple apology diffused some of her anger. What did the sheriff mean about making things more conventional? Thomas's expression grew uncomfortable. "He meant that a man and woman living together, unmarried, is causing talk, especially now that I'm staying in the house." "Oh," Eleanor felt a blush creep up her neck. "I see." "Eleanor," Thomas said carefully, "I want you to know that I would never expect. That is, our arrangement doesn't require." I know, she interrupted, saving him from his awkward attempt at reassurance. But the sheriff has a point. Jenkins will use any weapon against us, including our reputation. Thomas nodded grimly, which puts us in a difficult position. Not necessarily, Eleanor said, her heart racing as she contemplated what she was about to suggest. There is a simple solution. Thomas looked at her questioningly. Marriage, she said, the word hanging in the air between them. Thomas's expression shifted from surprise to something more complex. Eleanor, marriage isn't something to enter into just to silence gossip. Is that what you think I'm suggesting? She asked, hurt creeping into her voice. A marriage of convenience, isn't it? No, Eleanor said firmly. Last night I told you how I feel about you. Those feelings haven't changed in the light of day. Thomas took a step closer, his expression intense. Marriage is forever, Eleanor. I won't enter into it lightly, and I won't allow you to do so either. I'm not suggesting it lightly, she insisted. I'm suggesting it because I love you, and because I believe you feel the same, even if you're too stubborn to admit it. Thomas's expression softened, and for a moment, Eleanor thought he might finally lower his defenses. But then he shook his head. Even if that were true, there are complications you're not considering. Such as the fact that Thomas Sullivan isn't my real name. Eleanor stared at him, stunned. What? Thomas or whoever he was looked away, his jaw tight. My real name is Thomas Sinclair. I changed it years ago after I got into trouble back east. What kind of trouble? Eleanor asked, her mind racing. The kind that follows a man, he replied grimly. The kind that makes him change his name and stay on the move. Are you a criminal? She asked directly, needing to know. No, he said firmly. But I killed a man in self-defense, the son of a very powerful, very vindictive man who made sure I was charged with murder. I fled before they could hang me for a crime I didn't commit. Eleanor absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with everything she knew about the man standing before her. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve to know who you're really dealing with before you talk about marriage, he said simply. And because I'm tired of lying to you, even by omission. Does anyone else know? The sheriff, Thomas shook his head. No one here knows. I've been careful. Eleanor considered this new information carefully. It explained so much about Thomas, his wariness, his reluctance to get close to anyone, his skills with a gun. But it didn't change how she felt about him. Thank you for telling me the truth, she said finally. It can't have been easy. Thomas looked surprised by her calm reaction. That's all you have to say. What would you have me say? That I'm shocked? I am. That I wish you'd told me sooner? I do. She stepped closer to him. But it doesn't change who you are now, the man I've come to know. Thomas searched her face, as if looking for signs of deception or disappointment. Eleanor, if anyone ever discovered who I really am, then we would face it together, she said firmly, just as we've faced everything else. A look of wonder crossed Thomas's face, as if he couldn't quite believe her acceptance. Slowly, almost reverently, he reached out to touch her cheek. You continue to surprise me, Eleanor Evans. Is that a good thing? She asked, leaning slightly into his touch. It's everything, he murmured, and then, finally, he was kissing her. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he feared she might push him away. But when Eleanor wrapped her arms around his neck, responding with all the passion she had been holding back for weeks, Thomas groaned and pulled her closer, deepening the kiss until they were both breathless. When they finally broke apart, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. I do love you, Eleanor, he admitted roughly. God help me, I've tried not to. Eleanor smiled, her heart soaring. Then stop trying, he chuckled, the sound warming her from within. I think I just did. So, Eleanor said, trying to keep her tone light despite the seriousness of the question, does this mean you're accepting my proposal? Thomas pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. I think I should be the one doing the proposing. Then what are you waiting for? She challenged. Thomas took her hand in his expression growing solemn. Eleanor Evans, you deserve a proper proposal on bended knee with a ring and pretty words, but all I have to offer right now is my heart, my protection, and my promise to spend every day trying to be worthy of you. Will you marry me? Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes, not tears of sorrow or humiliation like those she had shed at the auction, but tears of joy. Yes, Thomas Sinclair, I will marry you. The following Sunday, in the small white church in Willow Creek, Eleanor Evans and Thomas Sullivan were married in a simple ceremony. Only a handful of people attended the preacher, and his wife, Sheriff Miller, and his deputy, and a few neighbors who had always been kind to Eleanor. Harold Jenkins and his supporters were conspicuously absent, which suited the couple just fine. Eleanor wore her mother's blue dress, freshly laundered and altered to fit her smaller frame. Thomas wore his best shirt and had even purchased a new tie for the occasion. Neither had ever looked happier. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared. "You may kiss your bride." Thomas took Eleanor's face in his hands with such tenderness that several of the female guests sighed audibly. The kiss was brief but heartfelt, a promise of all that was to come. As they walked back down the aisle together, Eleanor caught snippets of whispered conversations among the guests. Never thought she'd find someone after turning down Jenkins. Heard he threatened Jenkins at gunpoint. Wonder how long it will last with that temper of his. But unlike the cruel mockery at the auction, these whispers couldn't touch her. She was Eleanor Sullivan now, and the man beside her had promised that she would never again face the world's cruelty alone. The newlyweds declined offers of a celebratory dinner in town, preferring to return to their homestead for a private celebration. As they drove the wagon home, the late afternoon sun painting the landscape in gold, Eleanor couldn't help but think of how much had changed in just a few short weeks. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "About fate," she replied. "If the bank hadn't foreclosed, if I hadn't cried at that auction, if you hadn't been passing through town that day, we might never have found each other." Thomas smiled, taking her hand in his. "I like to think I would have found you somehow. Some things are meant to be, Eleanor." As the homestead came into view, Eleanor gasped. During the hours they had been in town, someone had been busy at work. A hand-painted sign hung over the porch. "Sullivan Homestead, ESD, 1878. Fresh flowers filled the window boxes, and a small table had been set up on the porch with a white cloth, two place settings, and a bottle of wine. "Thomas, did you do this?" Eleanor asked, delighted by the surprise. He nodded, looking pleased with her reaction. "I had some help from the preacher's wife. She came out early this morning while you were getting ready in town." "It's perfect," Eleanor said, blinking back happy tears. Thomas helped her down from the wagon, but instead of letting her walk to the house, he swept her up into his arms. "Thomas, what are you doing?" she laughed, throwing her arms around his neck. "Carrying my wife across the threshold," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It's tradition." "Since when do you care about tradition?" she teased. "Since I married the most beautiful woman in Wyoming Territory," he replied, carrying her up the porch steps with ease. "I intend to do this marriage business properly, Mrs. Sullivan." The way he said her new name sent a shiver of anticipation down Eleanor's spine. As he set her down in the doorway, she kept her arms around his neck, drawing him down for a kiss that held all the promise of the night to come. Later, as they sat on the porch enjoying their wedding supper and watching the sunset, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them together. From the humiliation of the auction to the joy of this moment, it had been a path filled with unexpected turns. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. Stepping in at the auction that day, taking on all of this, she gestured to the homestead around them. Thomas considered her question carefully, as he did most things. "Not for a moment," he finally said. "Meeting you, loving you, it's given me something I never thought I'd have again. A home, a purpose." He took her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "A future." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment washing over her. "Those tears at the auction really were the last I'll shed from sorrow," she murmured. "I can't promise you'll never cry again," Thomas said honestly. "Life has a way of bringing both joy and pain, but I can promise you'll never face either one alone." As darkness fell around them, the first stars appearing in the vast Wyoming sky, Eleanor and Thomas Sullivan began their life together, bound by love, strengthened by adversity, and determined to build something lasting on the land that had brought them together. The months that followed were not without challenges. Winter came early that year, bringing bitter cold and heavy snowfall that tested the limits of their preparation. The barn, still not fully repaired after the fire, proved inadequate shelter for their small herd of cattle. Thomas worked tirelessly to reinforce it, often returning to the house with fingers so numb he could barely grip his coffee cup. Eleanor worried about him pushing himself too hard, but she also understood his determination. This was his first winter as a settled man, his first time responsible for livestock and land through the harsh months. He was determined not to fail. "You know," she said one evening as she rubbed salve into his chapped hands by the fire, "my father always said winter on the frontier separates those who will last from those who won't." Thomas flexed his fingers carefully. "And what do you think? Will we last?" Eleanor smiled, remembering how her father had held their family together through blizzards, drought, and illness. "Yes," she said confidently, "we will. They did more than last, they thrived." By the time spring arrived, transforming the snow-covered landscape into a sea of green, they had not only survived but had made plans for expansion. Thomas had used the long winter evenings to draw up plans for a larger barn and a proper corral. Eleanor, meanwhile, had calculated how much additional land they could cultivate with the seeds they had carefully saved. The tension with Harold Jenkins had not disappeared entirely, but it had subsided into a cold war of sorts. Jenkins no longer sent men to harass them directly, but he used his influence to make certain aspects of business difficult. Local merchants sometimes claimed to be out of supplies the Sullivans needed, or quoted prices significantly higher than those offered to others. "He's trying to squeeze us out slowly," Thomas observed after another frustrating trip to town, "hoping we'll eventually give up and sell." "Then he's underestimating how stubborn we can be," Eleanor replied, unpacking the meager supplies they had managed to purchase. "Besides, we're becoming less dependent on town with each passing month." It was true. They had expanded their garden, were raising more of their own meat, and had even begun trading directly with neighboring homesteaders, bypassing the town merchants altogether. The Sullivan homestead was becoming known for its quality produce and fair trading, earning the respect of the surrounding community even as it drew Jenkins's continued ire. One warm day in late spring, as Eleanor was hanging laundry in the yard, she spotted a cloud of dust on the road indicating approaching riders. She shaded her eyes, trying to make out who was coming. Thomas was in the north field, too far away to call easily. As the riders drew closer, Eleanor recognized Sheriff Miller along with his deputy and another man she didn't know. Her stomach tightened with apprehension. The sheriff rarely made social calls, especially with an entourage. She set down her laundry basket and walked to meet them, forcing herself to appear calm despite her racing heart. "Sheriff Miller," she called as they approached, "this is an unexpected visit." The sheriff dismounted, removing his hat. "Mrs. Sullivan, is your husband around?" "He's working in the north field," Eleanor replied. "I can fetch him if it's urgent." The sheriff exchanged a glance with the unknown man who remained mounted. "I'm afraid it is urgent, madam. This is Marshal Hawkins from Denver." Eleanor's blood ran cold. A marshal from Denver could only mean one thing: someone had discovered Thomas's true identity. She fought to keep her expression neutral. "I see. Well, please make yourselves comfortable on the porch. I'll get Thomas." She walked at a measured pace until she was out of their direct line of sight, then hitched up her skirts and ran as fast as she could toward the north field. Thomas was mending a section of fence, his shirt discarded in the warm weather, his skin bronzed from the sun. He looked up in alarm as she approached, running full tilt across the uneven ground. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" He dropped his tools immediately. "Marshal," she gasped, trying to catch her breath. "From Denver, with the sheriff. They're waiting at the house." Thomas's face paled beneath his tan. "Did they say what they want?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, but Thomas." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what a marshal's appearance likely meant. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, a muscle working in his jaw. When he opened them again, his expression was resolved. "All right. Let's not keep them waiting." "What are you going to do?" Eleanor asked, fear making her voice shake. "Talk to them," Thomas said simply. "Find out what they know." "And if they know everything?" Thomas took her hands in his gaze steady despite the gravity of the moment. "Then we'll face it together, like we promised." They walked back to the house hand in hand, each step bringing them closer to a confrontation that could destroy everything they had built. Eleanor found herself mentally cataloging their options they could run, try to start over somewhere even more remote. But deep down, she knew Thomas was tired of running, tired of living under false names and looking over his shoulder. The sheriff and marshal stood as they approached the porch. The marshal was an older man with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Thomas Sullivan?" the marshal asked, though it didn't sound like a question. "Yes," Thomas replied evenly. "What can I do for you, Marshal?" "I think you know why I'm here, Mr. Sinclair," the marshal said, using Thomas's real name with deliberate emphasis. Eleanor felt Thomas tense beside her but admired how he kept his composure. "I suspected as much when my wife told me a marshal from Denver was waiting," he acknowledged. "How did you find me?" "A former associate of yours recognized your description when passing through Cheyenne," the marshal explained. "Said a man matching your description had settled near Willow Creek under the name Sullivan. Given the outstanding warrant for your arrest in Colorado Territory, I decided to investigate personally." "Outstanding warrant," Sheriff Miller interjected, clearly surprised. "What for?" "Murder," the marshal said grimly. "Of one Edward Blackwell, son of Judge Marcus Blackwell of Denver in 1876. Sheriff Miller's eyes widened as he turned to look at Thomas with new wariness. "Is this true, Sullivan? Or Sinclair, I should say." "The warrant exists," Thomas acknowledged, "but I didn't murder anyone. Blackwell challenged me to a duel over a perceived slight to his honor. I tried to walk away. He drew first. I defended myself. His father made sure the truth never came out at the inquest." The marshal's expression remained impassive. "That's not for me to decide. My job is to bring you in to face trial." Eleanor stepped forward, unable to remain silent any longer. "Marshal Hawkins, my husband is a good man. He's worked hard to build a life here, to be a valuable member of this community. Surely there must be some way to resolve this without tearing him away from everything we've built." The marshal's stern expression softened slightly as he regarded Eleanor. "Mrs. Sullivan, I understand your concern, but the law is the law. Your husband stands accused of a serious crime." "A crime he didn't commit," Eleanor insisted. "Surely that matters." "It will matter to the court," the marshal replied. "If what he says is true, he should be able to prove it at trial." "In a court controlled by Judge Blackwell?" Thomas asked skeptically. "The man swore he'd see me hang for his son's death, guilty or not." A heavy silence fell over the group. Eleanor's mind raced, searching for anything that might help their situation. Then she remembered something Thomas had told her months ago. "Sheriff," she said suddenly, turning to Miller. "You said once that Jenkins has influence in this county. Does that include connections in Denver?" The sheriff frowned. "Jenkins has business partners throughout the territories. Why?" "Because this timing is too convenient," Eleanor explained. "Just as our homestead is beginning to thrive, just as Jenkins's attempts to drive us out have failed, suddenly a marshal appears with a 2-year-old warrant." The marshal looked between them, his interest clearly piqued. "Are you suggesting this Jenkins character might have had something to do with my being informed of Mr. Sinclair's whereabouts?" "I'm suggesting it's worth considering," Eleanor replied. "Especially since Jenkins has made no secret of wanting our land." The sheriff scratched his chin thoughtfully. "She has a point, Marshal. Jenkins has been trying to get his hands on this property for years, first from the Evans family, now from the Sullivans." The marshal studied Thomas carefully. "Is there anyone who could corroborate your version of the events with young Blackwell? Any witnesses to the duel?" Thomas thought for a moment. "There was a saloon girl named Ruby who saw the whole thing, and the bartender, an older man named Wilson. They both heard Blackwell challenge me and saw him draw first." "Ruby Wilkes?" the marshal asked, surprising them all. "Yes," Thomas confirmed, clearly astonished that the marshal knew the name. "Do you know her?" A ghost of a smile crossed the marshal's weathered face. "She's married to my nephew now, lives in Laramie." He paused, seeming to make a decision. "I'll tell you what. I came here to bring in a fugitive, but what I'm hearing gives me pause. I'll delay taking you in while I verify this information. If what you say checks out, perhaps we can approach Judge Blackwell about dropping the charges." Hope flared in Eleanor's heart. You would do that. I've been a lawman for 30 years, Mrs. Sullivan, the marshal said. I've learned that sometimes justice and the law don't always align perfectly. If your husband is telling the truth, and if someone is manipulating the system to persecute him, I want to know about it. Thomas extended his hand to the marshal. Thank you. I give you my word I won't run. The marshal shook his hand firmly. See that you don't. I'll be back within the week. After the lawman departed, Eleanor and Thomas stood in stunned silence for several moments, absorbing what had just happened. The reprieve was temporary, but it was more than they had dared hope for. Do you think he really means to help? Eleanor finally asked. Thomas nodded slowly. I think he's a good man doing a difficult job. Whether he can help depends on what he discovers in Laramie. And if Ruby corroborates your story, then we have a chance, Thomas said simply. More of a chance than I ever thought I'd get. The days that followed were among the most tense they had experienced together. They continued their work on the homestead, but every approaching rider, every unusual sound made them both jump. Night brought little rest, as they lay awake discussing contingency plans, weighing options, preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. On the fourth day, as they were taking a midday meal in the shade of the large oak tree near the house, they heard the now familiar sound of approaching horses. Eleanor grabbed Thomas's hand, squeezing it tightly as they both stood to meet whatever was coming. Marshal Hawkins rode at the front, his expression unreadable. Behind him came Sheriff Miller and, to their surprise, Harold Jenkins himself, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, the marshal greeted them as he dismounted. I believe we have some matters to discuss. Did you find Ruby? Thomas asked, unable to contain the question. I did, the marshal confirmed. She and Mr. Wilson both provided sworn statements confirming your account of the events with young Blackwell. It seems you were indeed defending yourself in a duel you tried to avoid. Relief washed over Thomas's face. And Judge Blackwell, that's a more complicated matter, the marshal admitted. The judge is a powerful man, not inclined to admit error. However, I've presented him with the evidence, and while he's not ready to completely exonerate you, he has agreed to consider reducing the charge to manslaughter with time served, given that you've established yourself as a contributing member of society. Time served, Eleanor repeated. But Thomas hasn't spent any time in prison. 2 years living as a fugitive, looking over his shoulder, unable to use his real name. The judge is willing to consider that punishment enough, with certain conditions. What conditions? Thomas asked warily. That brings us to Mr. Jenkins here, the marshal said, gesturing to the cattle baron, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. It seems your suspicions were correct, Mrs. Sullivan. Mr. Jenkins did indeed use his connections to alert certain parties in Denver about your husband's whereabouts. Jenkins cleared his throat uncomfortably. Now see here, I was simply upholding the law. Save it, Jenkins, the sheriff interrupted. We know you were hoping to get Sullivan out of the way so you could pressure Mrs. Sullivan into selling the homestead. The marshal fixed Jenkins with a steely gaze. Which brings me to the judge's conditions. In exchange for reducing the charges against Mr. Sinclair, he wants a signed statement from Mr. Jenkins admitting to his attempts at intimidation and property damage, as well as his manipulation of the legal system for personal gain. Eleanor gasped. You mean? I mean that in order for your husband to be free of the murder charge, Mr. Jenkins here needs to confess to his own wrongdoings, the marshal confirmed, and agree to cease all harassment of your family and property. Jenkins's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. This is outrageous. I won't sign any such thing. Then Mr. Sinclair goes back to Denver to stand trial for murder, the marshal said calmly, and I take your signed confession about the barn fire and your other activities to the territorial governor. I'm sure he'll be interested to learn how one of the county's leading citizens conducts business. A tense silence fell as Jenkins visibly struggled with his options. Finally, he spat on the ground. Fine, I'll sign your damned statement, but this isn't over, Sullivan. Actually, it is over, the sheriff interjected. That's the whole point of this arrangement, Jenkins. You leave the Sullivans alone permanently, or you face charges yourself. As the men moved to the porch to handle the paperwork, Eleanor pulled Thomas aside, hardly daring to believe what was happening. "Is this real?" she whispered. "Are you really going to be free?" Thomas looked as stunned as she felt. "It appears so," he said, watching the marshal produce documents from his saddlebag. "Though I'm having trouble believing it myself." "No more looking over your shoulder," Eleanor said, joy bubbling up inside her. "No more hiding who you really are." Thomas turned to her, his eyes bright with emotion. "I haven't been hiding who I really am since I met you, Eleanor. You saw the real me even when I was using a false name." An hour later, all the papers were signed. Jenkins rode away without another word, his defeat evident in the rigid set of his shoulders. The sheriff followed shortly after, leaving the marshal to conclude his business with the Sullivans. "The judge will want to see you in person eventually," he told Thomas, "to formally close the case. But there's no rush. You can travel to Denver when it's convenient, perhaps after the harvest." Thomas nodded. "Thank you, Marshal. I don't know how to repay you for this." The marshal smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through his official demeanor. "Live a good life, Mr. Sinclair. Be the man your wife believes you to be. That's repayment enough." He tipped his hat to Eleanor. "You're a fortunate man to have such a steadfast partner." "Don't I know it?" Thomas agreed, slipping an arm around Eleanor's waist. After the marshal rode away, Eleanor and Thomas stood in the yard of their homestead, watching until he disappeared from view. The future stretched before them, suddenly wider and more full of possibility than ever before. "Thomas Sinclair," Eleanor said, trying out his real name. "I think I like it better than Sullivan," Thomas chuckled. "It'll take some getting used to, hearing my real name again after so long." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Would you mind being Eleanor Sinclair instead of Sullivan?" "I wouldn't mind at all," she replied with a smile, "though we might need to change that sign." She nodded toward the Sullivan homestead sign still hanging proudly over their porch. "First thing tomorrow," Thomas promised. He looked around at the land that had brought them together, his expression thoughtful. "You know, with Jenkins off our backs and my legal troubles potentially resolved, we could do more with this place. Expand, maybe. What did you have in mind?" Eleanor asked, recognizing the spark of excitement in his eyes. "I've been thinking about horses," Thomas admitted. "Not just for work, but for breeding. There's good money in quality stock, and with the railroad expanding west." Eleanor smiled, loving how he was already looking to the future, making plans for their life together. "I think that's a wonderful idea. My father always said this land was perfect for raising horses." "There's something else I've been thinking about," Thomas said, suddenly looking a bit nervous. "Something else that might expand." Eleanor tilted her head questioningly. "Oh, our family," Thomas clarified, watching her face carefully for her reaction. "I know we haven't talked much about children, but I want that too," Eleanor said softly, her heart full to bursting. "I've wanted it for some time now." The smile that broke across Thomas's face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around in a circle, their laughter echoing across the homestead. As he set her down, he kept his arms around her, his expression growing serious despite his smile. "I love you, Eleanor Sinclair, more than I ever thought possible." "And I love you, Thomas Sinclair," she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him, "more with each passing day." The Wyoming sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink as they stood together. No longer an outlaw and an orphan thrown together by circumstance, but partners in the truest sense of the word, bound by love, strengthened by adversity, and looking toward a future as vast and promising as the frontier itself. 1 year later, the homestead that now proudly bore the Sinclair Ranch sign had transformed dramatically. The new barn stood tall and sturdy, housing not only their growing herd of cattle, but also the beginning of Thomas's dream, a modest but quality collection of breeding horses. The cabin had been expanded to include 2 additional rooms, with Thomas having discovered an unexpected talent for carpentry. But the greatest change of all was the small cradle that sat near the fireplace, occupied by 2-month-old Joseph Thomas Sinclair, named for Eleanor's father and his own. "I think he has your eyes," Thomas said, gazing down at his son as the infant blinked sleepily in the evening light. And your stubborn chin," Eleanor replied with a smile, leaning against her husband's shoulder as they both admired the miracle they had created. The journey to this moment had not been without its challenges. Thomas's trip to Denver to formally resolve his legal troubles had been tense, with Judge Blackwell clearly reluctant to let go of his vendetta. But with Marshal Hawkins's support and the sworn testimonies, the judge had ultimately been forced to reduce the charges as agreed, officially closing the case that had haunted Thomas for years. Harold Jenkins had kept his word, or perhaps more accurately, had been forced to keep his word about ceasing his harassment. Rumors around town suggested he had shifted his attention to properties further north, having finally accepted that the Sinclair homestead would never be his. As for Eleanor, she had discovered that the tears Thomas had promised would be her last at the auction truly had been the end of her sorrow. There had been tears since then, of course tears of joy on their wedding night, tears of relief when Thomas returned safely from Denver, tears of wonder when she first held their son in her arms. But never again had she shed tears of helplessness or despair. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "About promises kept," she replied, smiling up at him. "About how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best." Thomas nodded, understanding immediately. "That auction was the best, worst day of my life," he agreed. "Seeing you there, so brave despite everything." "I didn't feel brave," Eleanor admitted. "I felt broken." "But you weren't," Thomas insisted, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You were bending, not breaking. There's a difference." Eleanor leaned into his embrace, thinking of all they had overcome together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been passing through town that day, if you hadn't stepped in?" "Sometimes," Thomas acknowledged, "but I prefer to think it was always meant to happen that way. That all my wandering was just leading me to you." Eleanor smiled at the romantic notion, so at odds with the practical man she had first met. Marriage and fatherhood had softened some of Thomas's harder edges, revealing the tender heart that had always existed beneath his guarded exterior. "Well, regardless of whether it was fate or fortune," she said, "I'm grateful every day that you were there." They fell into a comfortable silence, watching as their son drifted off to sleep. Outside, the Wyoming wilderness stretched in all directions, beautiful and harsh, challenging and rewarding much like their life together had been. Eleanor thought back to that fateful auction, to the cruel laughter of the townspeople as she had cried publicly, to the tall stranger who had silenced them all with 7 simple words. Those tears are the last she'll shed. He had kept that promise, not by preventing all tears, but by ensuring that she would never again face life's hardships alone. Together, they had built something neither of them could have created on their own: a home, a family, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky outside their window, Thomas pressed a gentle kiss to Eleanor's temple. "Happy?" he asked softly. Eleanor smiled, feeling the perfect contentment of being exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly who she was meant to be with. Completely. In the small cradle, little Joseph sighed in his sleep, secure in the love that surrounded him, the same love that had begun with an act of kindness at an auction, grown through shared work and shared dreams, and now extended to a new generation. The Sinclair legacy, born from tears but built on strength, would continue to flourish on the Wyoming frontier for many years to come. The last light of day faded from the windows of the Sinclair ranch, leaving the small family bathed in the warm glow of the hearth fire and the even warmer glow of a love that had overcome every obstacle placed in its path. For Eleanor and Thomas, the journey had only just begun.